Hi, this is Alex from Tileyard Education, and this is an introductory video to Steinberg's Cubase. So if we just look at the arrangement window now, this is the first window that you'll see when you come into Cubase. It's pretty similar to any other DAW in that it's linear. You've got the arrangement view here where you have all of your tracks, whether that be audio, MIDI, instrument, blah, 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 blah. All the list of the tracks are down here, and of course the regions are going to be in here. Now, in the latest versions of Cubase from Cubase Pro 9, they've introduced like a couple of new zones. So you can have the left zone over here, where you have what's called the inspector window. And in the inspector window, if I just create a track very quickly, I'm going to right click, go add audio track. And if I drag this up from the screen, then it's going to look like that. I'm just going to create a mono track. I'm not going to set any inputs at the moment because we'll do that in a future video with basic recording, but I just want to show you the inspector tab on the left. So we have our audio track here, and as you can see, it's brought up the inspector window on the left. Now, if you click on the top tab where it says audio 1, we haven't renamed our track obviously, but if we click on that, we have a number of options here. Now, these are going to be quite similar to the ones that we can see on the track itself here, but we have mute, have solo, have the record enable, input monitoring, we have musical mode, we have freezing, we have locking tracks. We can go into more detail in that. We have read and write automation, as well as volume, panning, and your inputs and outputs. That is the same as is presented on the actual track itself. So moving on into the next thing, you have what's called track versions. This is a very useful feature in Cubase, much like the same as playlists in Pro Tools, where you can either create a new version or a duplicate version. And I personally use this if I'm making any changes to a particular part that if I'm experimenting, I'll often use it for that. I've assigned a key command though to it because you can create your own in Cubase, the same as the Pro Tools create new playlist function. But the track versions are basically used to create just a new version of the track, and you can go in between different versions when they show up here. So if I create a couple of new versions there, you can go in between. So if I create one over there, I can switch to version 1 and it won't be the same, but if I go here now, I can go there. And so what I can do, if this is all a different part, I can switch in between them if I want, and I can also duplicate them as well. So that will be the same if I wanted to make any changes and I was a bit unsure of them. So versions is a really, really useful feature of Cubase that I use all the time. So I'm just going to get rid of these really quickly. Okay, cool. So the next one is the chord track. Now this is a very useful feature in Cubase. It's very deep, so I think this is going to need another video on it, but it's a very, very useful feature that you can do to create your own chord symbols. So you can change things on the chord track to things like piano voicings and guitar voicings and stuff, which is a really useful feature if you don't have as much knowledge of music theory, and it can kind of get you creating and writing as soon as possible. We then have our insert slots here. Now these are where you put all your plugins. This green line indicates where it's going to be pre-fader. So all of these plugins are what's called pre-fader, and these are your post-fader, and you can change this around however you want in the menu. There are 16 slots, which is new to the last few versions of Cubase. So the channel strip is a very useful feature of Cubase. So if you press the letter E, it comes up with the channel settings for this. Now this is a similar version of the inspector window, but if we go to this channel strip function, which is what it says over here as well, you have a number of features here that you can use in Cubase. So you can have a gate, you can have a compressor, you can have an EQ, which you can also tweak in this tab here, which is a really useful quick function with all sorts of EQ you can do. So that's cool. You've also got a number of tools here. So you can have a de-esser and an envelope shaper. I personally use the envelope shaper a lot to give something just a little bit more attack, or like a slower attack or longer release, I use it as a very subtle tool, but the fact that it's just there in the channel strip in Cubase makes it very, very easy and quick to work with. You also have saturation as well. You have 3 different types of saturation. You got magneto, a tape saturation, and a tube saturation as well as a limiter. So it's all open here in the channel strip. They sound amazing. They're very quick, very easy, and I often use these if I just don't want to pull up a third party. I just need just a bit of EQ, or just a bit of compression, or a bit of limiting. It's a very, very quick feature of Cubase. And you can also just press E to bring up the channel setting as well. Obviously, the equalizers is part of that channel that I showed you. Here are your auxiliary sends and turns. So these are all going to be where you might send your reverb or your delay, your parallel compression, your parallel distortion. All of them are done here, and they are also accessible in this window here as well. So you've got the inserts on the left that I mentioned earlier, and the sends on the right. You then got our fader for the individual track, which is pretty self-explanatory. You got panning on top, you got solo, mute, and then you got the channel settings that you can use there as well. We got a notepad where you can just type in anything, saying take 1 is good, for example. Often take 1 is not good, but who knows. So what you can do with that, which is a really useful feature, is basically if you want to export them as notes to send to another producer, maybe in a separate DAW, then you can do that through the exporting functions in there. All right, cool. So that's the inspector window where you can find nearly all of the things that you need. You can also customize what you want to see. You can customize it so the fader is always there. What I love about Cubase personally is that it is very customizable. So if I literally only wanted to see the fader, for example, I can get rid of all of these and literally just have the fader show up there. I don't need the chord track, don't need the notepad, have the fader, and if I want, I can also go into the setup menu. You can, what's called, pin that to the track. So all tracks that you create, if I add a couple of instrument tracks, for example, these are all of Contact, then the fader will always be pinned there. So the fact that you can customize all of this is a very, very useful workflow feature. So that's all on the left side of Cubase. On the right zone, you have a number of things from the Vst Instruments. Now this is a new feature in Cubase 10 where you can scroll down to whichever instrument you want and just drag it into the arrangement window, and it will open up a copy of that with the synthesizer or software instruments or whatever you are working with, which is a very useful feature. You have Vst Effects, which is exactly the same thing, apart from it's with plugins. So if, for example, you wanted the new Destroyer plugin on this track, you can literally put that on and it will insert it into your inserts, like so. So that's a very useful feature as well. There's a number of loops and samples. I can't remember exactly how many gigabytes it is, but you've got loads of different loops. You've got loads of different one-shots, you know, all sorts of kits and hip-hop loops and just all sorts of ideas and ambiences and things to get you going and started off in Cubase. So that's a really useful feature, alongside a load of track presets, user presets, file browser. It's basically for the instruments, effects, loops, and all sorts of other bits is this right hand zone. However, there are a number of tabs in here. So if we go to the VST one firstly, you can have a list of all your VST instruments if you need there. I mean, I personally don't use it as much, but if you're working with multiple instances of contacts and you have lots of MIDI routing and things like that, then that can be really useful. I know a lot of film composers do that. We've obviously gone through all the media tab. A really interesting feature of Cubase is the control room. It's not enabled now, but when you enable it, you can basically set up things like Q sends for headphones, different headphone mixes, and all sorts of things like that. And then we have a meter section as well, which is obviously your master fader, but you can also go to many different scales and standards depending on what you're working in. So and the eBooth, DIN, the Nordic, and of course all the K system as well. So this is a really, really interesting feature of it, as well as loudness and LUFS meters and things like that. So those are the main two zones. You also have a lower zone as well, which is a really, really interesting feature. We have the mix console, have an editor. So if we have, for example, like a MIDI track, we can edit all of our MIDI in there. There's a sampler control where we have a new sampler in Cubase, which is really nice. And we also have the chord pads as well, which is a useful feature if you don't know as much about music theory. It links to the chord track that I mentioned earlier and can be a really useful tool when writing, as there's also a chord assistant that you can use on this as well. Like everything else in Cubase, this is very customizable, so you can choose not to have chord pads there, or you can choose not to have the mix console, etc., etc. So that is the lower zone. These three zones can also be hidden and shown if you want from these three here. You can also assign keyboard shortcuts to all of them, which is an interesting feature. So just going over the top menu now. So the first thing that you'll see on the left is just an undo and redo button. This is not only applicable in the arrangement view, but it's also applicable in the mix console as well. So any changes that you make in the mix console, I'll make a couple of changes now. Gonna pan that right, pan that left, blah, 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 blah. What you can do is go onto this history tab there and basically undo all of those features if you may not have got something right on a mix, or you're just not feeling as good about it as you were previously, which is a really, really useful feature, especially in the mix console. The configurations, you can save configurations of all of these, because like I say, that everything is very customizable. We won't go through that now because this is the default one that comes with Cubase. You've obviously got mute, deactivate all the muted tracks, deactivate all the solo tracks, activate all the read automation, the write automation, and suspend all read and write automation as well. So this tab here is the global automation mode, where you can switch in between the touch, auto latch, and the crossover. We then move over to this tab here, which can be activated by pressing F. And what that does is it will follow events on the playback cursor, which is a very useful thing if you want to perhaps follow like a MIDI event, or just like an audio event in the arrangement window. This is all applicable to all the different windows. So it's a very, very useful thing that you can just switch on and off by pressing F. And then you've got all your tools here. Now, going just through them quite quickly, we got our standard tool, which is the object one, which is just a normal mouse. We have a range selection tool, which you can press the number 2 for, which is going to obviously select lots of different ranges. So this can be applicable to things like automation, if you want to just do that, and switch different bits of automation there or just there. It's a very, very useful feature, and it can just be activated by pressing the number 2. So the draw tool is pretty self-explanatory. You can obviously draw in different types of automation, like so. And you can also draw in different types of MIDI as well. So you can, if you get the pencil tool, so that's the pencil tool. Next is obviously the erase tool. That's fairly self-explanatory. The next is the split tool, which, for example, say if I had a region, it's pretty self-explanatory. You can just split up pieces of audio or MIDI, or you can also split up pieces of notes and things like that as well. So it's very quick and accessible. And then the next one is the glue tool. This is an interesting one. So say if I had one region here, and then I had one region there, and let me just put in something very, very quickly. It's obviously not going to sound very musical, but we'll work through it. Okay, so that's our one region. Let me just go out again and extend these. So say we had that, and then we had the same thing again. Hold Alt, drag, and if I just drag this down a couple, If I wanted to glue these two here together, I can use my object tool, which is obviously the default tool, highlight over them, click on the glue tool and click, and then that will merge those two regions there into one. So it's gone from two individual ones to one, and that's quite a useful feature if you want to clean things up a bit and not have so many regions in your tracks. The next one is the mute tool, which I think is pretty obvious. See that there? If I have the mute tool, unmute it and mute it. So that's just muting regions. You can either mute the track if you want to mute everything, or you can mute an individual region if you don't like a certain part and want to experiment without it maybe. So the next is the zoom tool. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. And then we have the comp tool. This is an interesting one. I'll just very quickly record a few takes of audio, just empty takes. Don't worry about the recording process. For now, we can go through another video talking about that. So I'm just going to very quickly record some audio. We'll do that again. We'll keep on doing it for a few. Okay, so we have quite a few takes there. Now, what I want to do is show the individual lanes of the tracks. Now, by clicking on that button there, you can unpack all of it and you can see all of the individual takes that you've done. So I'm going to get my comp tool, which you can find there. It says comp. And say if this was a vocal and I really, really liked that bit there, but then that bit there wasn't so good in that take. So I'm going to go for that bit for the first half, and then I'm going to go for that bit afterwards. So what I can do with the comp tool is basically pick and choose which bits I want of the audio. And that's only done through the comp tool. So it's a useful little tool that obviously needs to be done if you want to comp vocals or guitars or drums or whatever instrument you've recorded. The next one is the time warping tool, or the warp grid. This is a bit more complex, and we can go into detail about how I use it with picture and syncing up things like tempo maps and all sorts of things like that. We have this shapes, well, it's called the line tool officially, but you can use it on things like automation, which is a really useful feature. You can also use it as like a sine wave. You can use it as a triangle. You can use it as a square. So this is basically like the shapes tool. It's not like officially called that, but it's very useful if you want to have certain types of automation or MIDI CC expression, a lot of different things like that. There's the scrub tool, where you can go in between small pieces of audio so you can hear it very, very slow and very fast. I don't use that as much, but that can be used for things like vocal editing. And then you have your color tool, which you can activate with the command Alt-Shift-C, and you can change to whatever color you want your track to be. Then next we have our quantize mode, which can just be activated there. Really easy. You can either press the letter J to toggle it on and off, and you can quantize it to multiple different things. So you can quantize it to events, to the cursor, and to lots of other things that is really, really useful when working with quantization with different either MIDI events or audio or whatever. It's a very useful tool. If you want to have more quantizing options, you can press Shift Q, and that will bring up the quantizing panel, where you can then adjust things like the grid, what rhythmic value you want it to be, the swing, the audio warp function. There's lots of different things. It's very, very deep, this. So this is worth a separate video, but it's definitely very, very useful for quick quantizing. Your quantized value can also be chosen up here. You can also use what's called the audio alignment panel in Cubase, which is a really, really interesting feature, which is used predominantly for vocals and backing vocals. But what it will do is, if you have a lead vocal and you want a backing vocal to be very, very tight and very on the grid to the lead vocal, then you can can align it through this tool, and you can align it however much you want, from 100% down to 40, or if you want a much more of a tight vibe, then definitely go for 100%. But if you want it a bit looser, a bit more natural, then experiment with that. It's a really interesting tool, and I use it a lot for my backing vocals, and it actually saves me a lot of time as well. So that's just, you also have, sorry, I forgot to mention, you have a transport bar down here that's completely customizable like everything else is in Cubase. You have obviously your play, stop, you have the cycle, you have obviously record, you have what bar number you're at, the tempo. It's the standard thing that you'll kind of find in any DAW, but this is all very customizable. I know I've said that a lot, but it's important to know that you can customize it to whatever your workflow is best at. So if you didn't want that down there, it's very easy. You can just go to this setup menu and choose anything that you don't want to be there and things that you do. So that was a basic overview of the arrangement window in Cubase. We're only scratching the surface here. There are other windows that I would like to explore in future videos, like the mix console, the MIDI key editor, the sampler control. There's lots of different things that we can look at, but for this first video, I just wanted to take you round the interface. It's really intuitive, really customizable, and yeah, I really hope you enjoy it.